The thermometer outside Mike Anderson's cabin window read a chilling 40 deg below zero and was still dropping. In 5 years of living in this remote corner of Alaska, he had never seen temperatures plunge so low. His modest wooden cabin, nestled deep in the wilderness, where the nearest town was a grueling 4-hour drive away, stood as a solitary outpost against an unforgiving landscape. Outside, the wind whipped through towering pines, carrying the promise of an approaching storm that would test even the most seasoned survivalist. Mike woke to the familiar crackle of his fireplace, its warmth barely reaching the frost-covered corners of his living room. At 45 years old, he had developed a careful morning routine, a sequence of tasks that ensured his survival in these extreme conditions. He checked his weather radio, a lifeline to the outside world, and assessed his supplies. Canned food, medical kits, and emergency gear lined the shelves of his cabin, all carefully maintained and within arm's reach. Through frost-rimmed windows, he noticed the heavy snow that had fallen overnight, burying his porch and blanketing the wilderness in a thick, silent shroud. It was February, the darkest stretch of winter, when the sun barely rose, and life itself seemed to hang in suspended animation. But Mike had learned to embrace the solitude. The constant presence of nature's raw power had instilled in him a deep respect for the environment and a keen sense of awareness. Photographs adorned the walls, images he had taken during his previous life as a wildlife photographer in Seattle. Wolves, moose, and grizzlies stared back at him, silent companions to his self-imposed exile. Each picture told a story of patience, danger, and beauty, captured during years spent observing creatures in their natural habitat. He had chosen this life for its simplicity, its rawness, and the challenge it offered to his endurance and resolve. That morning, however, the weather report set him on edge. A massive storm was barreling in from the north, promising temperatures that could shatter records. Winds strong enough to uproot trees were on the way, bringing snow so dense it could bury cabins like his. Mike secured his generator, double-checked the heat tape on his water pipes, and brought extra firewood inside. He knew better than to underestimate nature's wrath. His father's words echoed in his mind, "Nature doesn't forgive carelessness, son." The afternoon brought the first gusts of wind, carrying with them the scent of ice, and the faint hiss of snowflakes striking his window. Mike added more logs to the fire, his thoughts wandering as he prepared for the long night ahead. Over the years, he had grown accustomed to storms and the isolation they imposed. He found solace in the quiet, strength in the routines that kept him alive. But as dusk settled and the storm intensified, an uneasy feeling gnawed at the edges of his mind. The cabin creaked under the strain of the howling wind, and the temperature gauge outside plummeted further. Mike, ever vigilant, checked his emergency supplies once more, ensuring his satellite phone was fully charged and his flashlights were ready. He sat by the window, watching the snow swirl in chaotic patterns, wondering how the wildlife he so often admired would fare in these brutal conditions. Then, just after midnight, a sound shattered the rhythmic wail of the storm, a deep, guttural noise that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He froze, his mind racing to identify it. The noise came again, louder this time, and Mike recognized it instantly. A bear. And it was close. His heart pounded as he grabbed a flashlight and peered out into the blizzard. 3 shapes materialized in the snow, dark, lumbering forms that moved slowly, almost painfully, toward his cabin. A mother bear and 2 cubs. Mike's breath caught in his throat as he realized something was terribly wrong. The bears' mournful cries cut through the howling wind, each one a desperate plea. Mike stared through the frost-covered window, his heart pounding. In the storm's dim light, he could barely make out the mother bear and her cubs, huddled together against the relentless onslaught of snow and wind. They were no more than 50 feet from his cabin, their dark forms stark against the endless white. Grabbing his flashlight and heavy parka, Mike hesitated for a moment at the door. This wasn't the first time he'd encountered wildlife in distress, but grizzlies were a different story. His father's warning rang in his ears, no matter how big or small, a bear in trouble is still a bear. Be careful, son. He stepped into the storm, the wind immediately cutting through his layers like icy blades. The flashlight beam wavered as he trudged through knee-deep snow toward the bears. As he drew closer, his stomach sank. The mother bear was limping badly, favoring one of her front paws, which was swollen and bloodied. One cub clung to her side, trembling, while the other lay motionless in the snow, barely breathing. Mike crouched a safe distance away, his breath visible in the frozen air. "What happened to you?" he murmured, more to himself than the animals. The bear raised her massive head, her dark eyes locking onto his. There was no aggression, no warning growl, only exhaustion and pain. It was as if she knew she had no fight left. The scene before him presented a dilemma unlike any he'd faced before. Mike had always respected the boundaries between humans and wildlife. His philosophy was simple: observe, don't interfere. But this wasn't a distant observation through a camera lens. This was raw, immediate, and personal. He stood there, the storm whipping around him, weighing his options. Bringing the bears closer to the cabin posed a risk not just to his safety but to theirs. If word got out, wildlife officials might intervene, and that often ended badly for animals that became too accustomed to humans. Yet leaving them here, exposed to the elements and predators, was a death sentence. The cub on the ground whimpered weakly, snapping him out of his thoughts. Mike approached cautiously, speaking in a low, steady voice. "It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you." The mother bear didn't move, her gaze following his every step. He reached the cub and quickly assessed its condition. It was dangerously cold, its tiny body shivering uncontrollably. Mike removed his scarf and gently wrapped it around the cub, lifting it into his arms. The mother bear let out a low rumble. But she didn't move to stop him. "You're just a baby?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're not going to make it out here." The second cub, still huddled against its mother, seemed slightly stronger but not by much. Mike knew he had to act quickly. He turned and trudged back to the cabin, his heart heavy with the weight of his decision. Once inside, he placed the cub near the fire, wrapping it in a blanket and rubbing its tiny paws to restore circulation. Outside, the storm raged on, and the mother bear's cries grew louder. Mike pressed his forehead against the cold window, torn. He had saved one cub, but what about the other? What about the mother? His cabin wasn't equipped to shelter a full-grown bear, and the risk of bringing her closer was enormous. Yet the image of her limp and bleeding, struggling to keep her cubs alive, gnawed at him. She had ventured dangerously close to human territory, likely as a last resort. It was a gamble on her part, one that spoke to the desperation of a mother fighting to protect her young. Mike glanced back at the cub by the fire, its faint breathing steadying. His hands shook, not from the cold but from the realization that he was now part of their story. The line between survival and interference blurred, and he knew the choices he made tonight could have far-reaching consequences for them and for him. As the wind screamed outside, Mike donned his parka again and grabbed his first aid kit. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. "All right, girl," he muttered. "Let's see what we can do." With that, he stepped into the storm, toward the mother bear and the cub still clinging to her side, knowing there was no turning back. The storm raged with an unrelenting fury, and the cabin's small wood stove struggled to keep the biting cold at bay. Inside, the cub lay nestled in a thick blanket near the fire, its tiny chest rising and falling in uneven rhythms. Mike crouched beside it, gently rubbing its paws and ears, his face a mask of concern. Every so often, he glanced toward the window, where the dark silhouette of the mother bear and her remaining cub loomed in the swirling snow. He couldn't leave them out there much longer. Mike paced the cabin, his mind racing. He had studied bears for years, documenting their habits and behaviors, yet nothing in his research had prepared him for this. A mother bear with cubs was one of the most dangerous encounters in the wild, yet here he was, contemplating how to save them without risking his life or theirs. The mother's injury complicated everything. If her paw was as bad as it looked, she wouldn't survive the night without help. But treating a bear, even one as weakened as she appeared, was a monumental task. And then there was the question of what would happen after. If the bear survived, they might associate humans with safety, making them more vulnerable to future conflicts with people. He stopped pacing and rubbed his temples, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. His father's voice echoed in his mind. "The wild doesn't owe us anything, Mike. Respect it, but don't try to control it." But what was respect in a situation like this? Was walking away and letting nature take its course the right choice, or just the easiest? Mike shook off the thought and began gathering supplies. He packed his first aid kit, a heavy-duty tarp, rope, and a few strips of dried venison. If he could create a makeshift shelter closer to the cabin, it might give the bears a fighting chance without putting them or himself in too much danger. Outside, the wind howled as he approached the mother bear again. He kept his movements slow and deliberate, his voice low and soothing. "Hey girl, I'm back. Let's see what we can do." The mother bear lifted her head, her dark eyes glinting in the faint light of his flashlight. She growled softly, a warning, but it lacked the usual ferocity. Mike crouched a few feet away, laying the tarp on the ground and scattering the venison nearby. The cub at her side sniffed the air, its small nose twitching, but it didn't move away from its mother's protective embrace. Mike unzipped the first aid kit and held up a small bottle of antiseptic spray. "This is going to sting," he murmured, inching closer. The mother growled again, but this time she didn't pull away. She watched him intently, her breathing labored. Working as quickly as he could, Mike sprayed the wound on her paw, wincing as she flinched and let out a low rumble of pain. He wrapped the paw in gauze, securing it with medical tape, all while keeping a wary eye on her massive claws. The entire process took only minutes, but it felt like hours. When he finished, Mike backed away slowly, his hands trembling. The mother bear sniffed her bandaged paw, then turned her attention to the venison. Her cub followed suit, nibbling hesitantly at the dried meat. Mike retreated to the cabin, his heart pounding. He watched from the window as the bears settled onto the tarp, the mother curling protectively around her remaining cub. A pang of guilt shot through him as he glanced at the cub by the fire. Splitting the family felt wrong, but he knew it had been necessary to save the weakest one. The hours ticked by, the storm showing no signs of letting up. Mike sat by the fire, sipping coffee and scribbling notes in his weathered journal. He documented everything: the mother's behavior, the cub's condition, the environmental factors at play. Writing had always been his way of processing the world, and tonight, it felt more important than ever. The next morning, the storm had eased, though the landscape remained buried under a thick blanket of snow. Mike ventured outside, his breath misting in the frigid air. The mother bear and her cub were still on the tarp, huddled together for warmth. Her bandaged paw looked slightly less swollen, but her movements were slow and labored. Mike knew he couldn't stop there. The bears needed a better shelter, something more substantial than a tarp in the open snow. He spent the morning constructing a makeshift lean-to using fallen branches, a tarp and rope. It wasn't perfect, but it would provide some protection from the wind and snow. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was crossing an invisible line. He had always prided himself on his ability to observe nature without interfering, but now every decision felt like a gamble. He wasn't just a spectator anymore, he was a participant, and the stakes were higher than ever. By midday, the lean-to was complete. Mike coaxed the mother bear and her cub toward it, using gentle gestures and the remaining venison as bait. To his relief, they accepted the shelter, the mother settling inside while the cub nuzzled against her side. For the first time in days, Mike allowed himself a moment of hope. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. He returned to the cabin, where the rescued cub was now more alert, its bright eyes following him as he moved around the room. As night fell, Mike sat by the fire, his thoughts a tangle of emotions. He had done everything he could, but doubts lingered. Had he made the right choices? Had he interfered too much or not enough? The wilderness was a place of balance, and he couldn't shake the fear that his actions might tip the scales in unforeseen ways. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, a reminder that the storm was far from over. Mike stared into the flames, his resolve hardening. Whatever the outcome, he was in this now. The bear's survival was tied to his own, and he would see it through to the end. Mike stood motionless by the cabin window, his gaze locked on the storm. The wind howled like a pack of wolves, shaking the old wooden frame and frosting the glass. Beyond the swirling snow, he could barely make out the crude lean-to he had built earlier. The shapes inside, huddled and faint, belonged to the wounded mother bear and her remaining cub. The sight clawed at him, but it was the sound from behind that twisted his heart further. The cub he had brought into the cabin whimpered again, its tiny frame trembling near the fire. He turned and crouched beside it, placing a hand gently on its fur. The heat of the flames wasn't enough to quell its shivering. It had been hours since he'd separated it from its family to save it from freezing, but its distress hadn't abated. "I know, little one," he murmured softly. "I know you miss her. I'm doing my best." But was he? That nagging question had haunted him since he first stumbled upon the bears 2 days ago. The mother's paw had been sliced open, probably on a shard of ice or a hidden rock, and her limp made it nearly impossible for her to hunt. With the storm raging, her cubs stood no chance of survival if she couldn't move or feed them. Mike had treated her wound as best as he could in the wild, but it wasn't enough. Now he faced a decision that went against everything he'd been taught. He paced the cabin, boots scuffing against the wooden floor. His mind whirled. For years he had followed the unspoken code of wilderness living: observe but don't interfere. Nature was brutal, but it was self-sustaining. Intervention, especially from humans, often caused more harm than good. His eyes fell on the sat phone on the table, its green light blinking faintly. He could call for help. Wildlife rescue teams were equipped to handle situations like this, and they could bring the bears to a sanctuary for rehabilitation. But the mere thought of involving them felt like a betrayal of everything he stood for. The wilderness didn't need saving, it needed respect. The cub by the fire whimpered again, pulling Mike from his thoughts. He knelt beside it, stroking its soft fur. "I've already broken the rules by bringing you in here," he whispered. "What's one more step?" But the decision wasn't that simple. If he called for help, it would mean exposing the bears to human intervention, a process that could make it impossible for them to return to the wild. Sanctuaries were safe, but they were cages. The thought of this mother bear and her cubs spending their lives in captivity made his stomach churn. Yet doing nothing felt equally wrong. The storm was unrelenting, and time was running out. He turned back to the window. Outside, the wind howled and the snow fell in blinding sheets. The mother bear's faint silhouette was still visible under the lean-to, her head resting on her paws, her body curled protectively around her cub. She had fought so hard to keep them alive, and now her survival rested on his shoulders. Mike stood frozen, his hand hovering over the sat phone. His pulse pounded in his ears. What was the right thing to do? He thought back to his earliest days in the wilderness, to the mentor who had taught him the ways of the wild. "The wilderness isn't just something you live in," the old man had said. "It's something you're part of. And being part of it means knowing when to let go and when to act." His grip tightened on the phone. The words echoed in his mind, clearer now than ever. He grabbed his coat and gear, bundling up for the storm. He packed a tarp, extra medical supplies, and a flare gun. The sat phone went into his pocket last, its weight heavier than anything else he carried. Before he left, he crouched beside the cub one last time. "I'm coming back," he promised. "And I'm bringing your family home." The storm greeted him with a ferocity that stole his breath. Each step toward the lean-to felt like a battle, the snow dragging at his legs, the wind slicing at his exposed skin. He moved by instinct, relying on his knowledge of the terrain. The lean-to appeared through the white haze like a mirage, its edges sagging under the weight of snow. The mother bear lifted her head as he approached, her growl weak but protective. He stopped a few feet away, dropping to one knee. "It's me," he said softly. "I'm not here to hurt you." He worked quickly, reinforcing the lean-to with the tarp and checking the mother bear's wound. Infection had set in, but it wasn't too late. He cleaned and dressed it again, his hands trembling from the cold and urgency. Finally, he pulled out the sat phone, the decision solidifying in his mind. He dialed the emergency line, his voice steady despite the storm raging around him. "This is Mike Harlow," he said. "I'm at Cabin 14 in the North Ridge sector. I've got a wounded bear and her cubs. I need assistance." The operator's response came swiftly, promising help within hours. Mike ended the call, relief and dread washing over him in equal measure. He had crossed the line he had sworn never to cross, but he had done it for a reason he could live with. Back at the cabin, he found the rescued cub sleeping by the fire, its tiny form peaceful for the first time. He sat beside it, exhaustion pressing down on him. Outside, the storm continued, but inside, there was a fragile sense of hope. For better or worse, he had chosen to act, and in that choice, he had found not just compassion but a deeper understanding of his place in the wild. The morning after the storm, the world outside the cabin was unrecognizable. The thick snow blanketed every branch and rock, transforming the wilderness into a pristine, silent expanse. For a moment it seemed untouched, as though nothing had disturbed it. But inside Mike's cabin, the story was far from over. The cub by the fire stirred, stretching its tiny legs and letting out a soft cry. Mike crouched beside it, offering a piece of fish he had warmed. It nibbled tentatively before curling back into a ball. The sight brought a flicker of warmth to his chest, but his mind remained on the mother bear and the other cub. The sound of a distant helicopter broke the quiet. Mike grabbed his coat and stepped outside, squinting against the bright morning light. The rescue team had arrived sooner than expected, their small chopper slicing through the clear sky and kicking up snow as it landed. Two wildlife specialists approached, their movements purposeful yet careful. Mike led them to the lean-to, where the mother bear lay with her cub. She growled weakly as they approached, her protective instincts intact despite her frailty. Mike stood back as the team worked, speaking softly to the bear and handling her with care. Watching them, Mike felt a mix of relief and sorrow. He knew this intervention meant the bears might never return to the wild. They would be treated, fed, and sheltered in a sanctuary a far cry from the life they were meant to live. But it was also a second chance, one they wouldn't have had without his decision. As the chopper lifted off with the bears, Mike stood in the clearing, the sound of the rotors fading into the distance. The silence that followed was deafening, a void filled with conflicting emotions. He had always prided himself on being an observer of the wild, a guardian who never interfered. But this time he had chosen to step in, to save lives rather than let nature take its course. Back at the cabin, Mike sat by the fire, the rescued cub curled at his feet. He stared into the flames, replaying the events of the past few days. He felt heavier, but not in a way that weighed him down. It was the weight of understanding, of knowing that sometimes the lines we draw for ourselves must be crossed for the sake of something greater. The wilderness would always be brutal, its cycles of life and death indifferent to human morals. But for Mike, this experience had shifted something fundamental. Being part of the wild didn't just mean respecting its laws, it also meant recognizing when compassion could coexist with those laws. As the cub nuzzled his leg, Mike smiled faintly. He didn't know what the future held for the bears or for himself, but he knew one thing for certain: he had done what he could, and for now, that was enough.